So this is it. This is the new DJI Air 3. I've actually been shooting with this the last couple of weeks. We're going to break it down with everything else on this table. So I've got the Mini 3, the Mavic 3, which is the one I use the most, and the last generation Air 2S, which I'm still holding on to. Now what's interesting is that this drone has quite a bit that's improved on it over the last couple of years. So let's kind of break down first the new features that make the Air 3 kind of stand out from everything else on this table. Now the hardware has changed quite a bit actually from the Air 2S. For starters, it's definitely a larger drone, so that's going to hit the bag space quite a bit, but that does have a few advantages. The first is going to be the battery, definitely larger, but 46 minutes of flight time, which is just crazy. Also, the way that you load this is kind of cartridge style, very similar to like the Mavic 3. And the way I see it, you can never have too much flight time because just the process of taking off, getting to the location you want to film, getting everything settings dialed in, everything set up like that, it eats quite a bit of battery, and you can't run a drone to zero. In fact, it's actually going to return to home automatically and land itself long before that. So I can't tell you like just how many times I've needed to land somewhere different than I planned. Maybe the landing location was no longer safe. I also shoot quite a bit from boats, and if you're doing that, sometimes I need a couple approaches before I can just safely catch it in the air while the boat is moving. So even if you need to give a couple extra minutes to get this landed safely, or you just want to fly to a pretty far location, this can now make it happen. Now the other pretty major difference is going to be the camera, and that's because now you have two of them. And one of the first things that I noticed though, the Air 2S, it had this pretty large 1-inch sensor, and now the DJI Air 3 has these smaller 1/3-inch sensors. I definitely prefer having a larger sensor whenever possible, but this isn't quite a downgrade because of what DJI is doing with this sensor. So now you have a backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. And if you've heard me say that before, you should have, because it's the same technology that Sony actually uses in their flagship A1, which is pretty insane. So you're going to be getting faster readout speeds because of the stack sensor. You're going to be getting better low light performance and dynamic range because of the backside illumination. And the result is you get some pretty amazing images and video from this drone. And with the video, you have 4K 60 in your standard format. And if you use the D-Log-M or HLG profiles, that's going to get you 10-bit recording on everything. Another thing to keep in mind is because the sensors are actually the same, you're going to get the same quality and frame rates no matter what. So for example, the Mavic it has a really good main camera, and it's an awesome, very large sensor, but the other camera doesn't quite. So quality and colors don't exactly match when you're switching up between those cameras. Whereas for the Air 3, you don't have to make that choice. And I actually found that I wanted to use the longer focal length quite a bit more because I absolutely love the look from it, and it was the same quality. So I think I'll be using it way more on this drone because not only are you getting those awesome parallax shots, there are just some situations where it's actually safer to operate a drone further away. Now the camera works a lot like the camera from phones. So by default, they take a 12 megapixel image, and then you can activate a high resolution mode. So in this case, a 48 megapixel mode if you want more resolution. Now there are two pretty big features that I admit kind of sound a little bit boring, but even if you're an amateur at drones, these might be some big reasons that you should upgrade to the Air 3. And the first is going to be omnidirectional sensors. And yes, it's probably not something that you're going to brag about to your friends, but literally while I was shooting over a car show, some guy managed to fly a drone straight into a light pole. It fell on the ground and shattered into like a ton of pieces. So he was actually flying the original Mavic Mini, which did not have obstacle sensing on the sides of it. So thankfully there wasn't a car right below him, or that would have cost him way more than a couple $100 and the embarrassment of having like 1,000 people staring and hardcore judging him while he picked up all of those pieces off the ground. But what's kind of interesting is that most people who are buying like your less expensive, smaller drones, those would be people with less flying experience, but those would be the drones that don't prevent you from running right into a wall. Whereas the Air 3 has much better obstacle detection, and it might be worth considering because it just might save you from a crash. The other big upgrade is going to be the O2 HD video transmission system, and Yes, that means you can fly further away, but really what it means for me is that I'm less likely to lose signal in general. Just the fact that I have a much stronger signal is a massive advantage for me. Now, the software is also seeing some pretty big upgrades. So you have time-lapse, you have hyperlapse, you have a bunch of intelligent flight modes now. The highlights for me are going to be waypoints, because I think this is the first air drone to actually get this feature, but also the tracking has improved. And I use the tracking like crazy. And there's two ways to kind of use this. Basically, it allows you to highlight your subject, and the drone can either completely follow the subject, or it can keep your subject in the center while you fly the drone. And this is the one that I use the most, because it allows me to get camera moves that would usually require like an Inspire 3 and dual operators, and it gets you some really cinematic things that would be pretty much impossible to do without that feature. Now, comparing this to the last generation Air 2S was a bit difficult, because even though this drone came out like 2 years ago, it actually had a larger 1-inch sensor, and it could capture 5.4K video with a native 20 megapixel sensor. And I was actually a massive fan of this drone, to the point that I still have it. I've kept it around, and I still occasionally shoot with it. But the drone does have a crop when you shoot in 4K 60, and that basically got rid of the large sensor advantage, and I use 4K 60 quite a bit. Plus, the new Air 3 has a backside illuminated stacked sensor, so it can also use binning to pull off that same exact pixel size. So it's actually better in low light, you have longer battery life, and you do get the second focal length, which I actually use quite a bit. Now, throwing this in with the Mavic 3 and the Mini 3 is going to be a whole lot easier. So the Mini 3, it's actually a very underrated drone. This thing is amazing. And I think the first couple of generations of the Mini series, DJI struggled with fitting enough features into a drone this small that still weighed under 250 grams. But with the Mini 3, the camera is actually great. The hardware is pretty amazing for what you're getting. And it actually has some cool features, like you can actually rotate the gimbal to be able to shoot in full vertical. Now, if you upgrade to the Air 3, while the camera doesn't rotate vertically like the Mini 3, there is this genius solution that honestly I think every camera should have. So because the sensor uses a 3:2 aspect ratio, when you're shooting 16:9 video, there's actually all this extra vertical space that's not being used. So the Air 3 allows you to shoot a native vertical 9:16 using the full height of the sensor in camera, which is going to be much better quality than actually doing a vertical crop in post. Plus, you're getting the upgraded cameras with more controls. You have two cameras. You have the O4 transmission system, which allows you to fly further. You get stronger signals. Definitely the obstacle avoidance is going to be big. You have more intelligent flight modes. You get a few extra minutes of battery life, which also helps. So basically, overall, this is a pretty big step up, not just in terms of quality, but just the way it flies and the features that you get. Now, the Mavic 3 is actually way closer to the Air 3 than I originally thought. So the Mavic 3 actually comes in two flavors. You can have the Mavic 3 Classic and the Mavic 3 Pro. And really the only difference between those is the cameras. The Mavic 3 Classic has a single Hasselblad 4/3 inch sensor. It's actually a really large sensor. And the Pro has that, plus it adds a 70mm 3x telephoto zoom lens, or telephoto prime lens, as well as a 7x zoom, which comes out to like 166mm lens. And honestly, the main lens and the 70mm lens are probably the only ones that you're going to use. In my opinion, like the 7x zoom, it's just a bit too much for anything really useful unless you just can't get to a location or you're scouting a location. And the 70mm lens on this is essentially the exact same as the Air 3. So mostly just that wider main camera is going to be the big upgrade when you move from the Air 3 to the Mavic 3. Now, there's actually another pretty big upgrade to the camera, and that's going to be that the Mavic 3 has an adjustable aperture and the Air 3 doesn't. And I would personally say that this is a pretty big deal if you shoot manual video and you really want to dial in that perfect 180 rule for motion blur, shooting twice the frame rate of the camera. And the reason is because lighting is always changing. So even if you apply the perfect ND filter to the drone when you're on the ground, as soon as you're in the air and the sun goes behind a cloud, now you have to increase the ISO, which cuts the quality. So being able to use your aperture to dial in a perfect exposure while you're in the sky He's really awesome and a huge help if you're shooting in manual video. Also, since all of the cameras have different apertures, every time you bounce between the different cameras, if you're shooting in manual, your exposure is going to change. So you have to actually compensate for that. And without an adjustable aperture, it's almost impossible to get that just perfect shutter speed dialed in with the Air 3. You also get the larger body, which definitely helps in the wind. You have 5K recording and a few more advanced video options like your full D-Log profile. But let me know, which one of these drones do you guys like the best? And hit me up with some questions. I'm sure you guys have them that I haven't answered yet. I'm actually working on some more content right now with the Air 3, so quality breakdowns between all of these drones. So definitely hit like, subscribe. I'll be posting some BTS over on IG as well. And tomorrow, I'm actually taking out some cross carts for a pretty insane shoot to test out some new gear. If I don't break anything, I'll be pretty surprised. But either way, we have some fun, really awesome, massive new videos on the way, so stay tuned.